Hello and welcome to a new podcast episode of Nina's Apothecary. I'm extremely happy that you're here again for today's exciting topic. I always try to address topics that you write to me about, that you tell me about, where I see a lot of attention, so that the focus simply goes there. So please keep it up and always write to me everywhere, or ideally just talk to me in person so I can always stay up to date on what interests you. Today's topic, you probably already saw in the title, is belly fat, because I really get asked this question a lot, especially as summer approaches. How can I lose my belly fat? Why do I have belly fat at all? Before we dive into that, the first question is, what is belly fat anyway? And what types of fat are there? There is visceral fat, which we have all surely heard of, but that is not the belly fat itself. Rather, it is the fat that surrounds our organs in the abdominal cavity. This can be positive and it can also be negative, like most things in life. The positive aspect is, of course, that our organs, including those in the abdominal cavity, need to be protected, and they also need to be stabilized in some way. And for that, fat is of course important. However, if it becomes too much, which I'll get to later, it can also lead to increased risks. Then there is also subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous meaning under the skin. That is what lies under the skin layer. This is not as risky as visceral fat, but it's of course not necessarily aesthetically pleasing and also not necessarily healthy. Subcutaneous fat has more of a storage function and a protective function, but shows fewer risk factors, which I'll discuss later, and has less impact on our internal organs and metabolism. The point is that this belly fat, this visceral fat, is not only a cosmetic problem, but can also pose a health problem. And I just want to explain this to you once without scaring you. Please don't worry, don't look down and think, oh my goodness, I'm just telling you, these are only potential risk factors or possible things that can happen. It's all relatively unlikely, but it's important to know. The first point is that belly fat is not beneficial for our cardiovascular health because it contains inflammatory substances. And when they are secreted, meaning as we have more belly fat, we also have more of these inflammatory substances. This gives us a higher risk of potentially developing cardiovascular diseases. The second point is that if we have more belly fat, we also have a higher risk of type 2 diabetes. You know, there are two types. Type 1 diabetes is the genetically determined one, the congenital one, even though it doesn't always have to be present from birth. And type 2 diabetes is what I like to call the eaten one. The risk of this increases when we have more belly fat, as this leads to lower insulin sensitivity and higher insulin resistance. Number 3, it can also lead to an increase in blood pressure, and thus also in the long term, which actually relates back to cardiovascular issues, but also to hypertension, meaning high blood pressure. Number 4, there are various studies that link visceral fat to different types of cancer or the development of various cancers. This means that there could also be a connection there. Number 5, it can also negatively affect our metabolism because the increase in belly fat can slow down the metabolism. It can lead to metabolic disorders. So, all things that are not necessarily so cool. And number 6, as I mentioned before, insulin resistance. This is not only related to diabetes, but also to increased inflammation in the body, more cravings, accumulation of even more fat in the body, and so on. But this belly fat can also have hormonal influences, and you know, hormones are like very fine little gears that need to mesh together like cogwheels. And if we have a derailment somewhere, whether it's in the thyroid or due to increased belly fat, in this belly fat, for example, more cytokines are produced, which are inflammatory substances, and this tissue that produces cytokines also produces hormones such as leptin and adiponectin. These regulate, among other things, our hunger, our energy balance, our metabolism, and we can already see that this has a very high impact. And as I mentioned before, cytokines are inflammatory substances that circulate throughout the body and disrupt everything. And since I previously mentioned hormones that are especially produced in this area or in this tissue, one hormone stands out in particular, and it is currently a hot topic. This hormone is cortisol, our stress hormone. The reason it is associated with this is that in our belly fat, in our visceral fat, we have 4 times as many stress receptors, or cortisol-producing receptors, compared to other tissue types. Now, if I imagine that I already have a bit of a belly, and then I experience a lot of stress and consume sugar or sugary drinks or certain fruits in this stress, stuffing them quickly into myself, it is clear that we already have 4 times as many. Depending on how thick this visceral fat layer is, we have even more, and this multiplies not only by 4. If we then consume carbohydrates, sugar, and sugary drinks, we will obviously have a significant increase in our belly fat, which can become extremely dangerous. I don't want to suggest, as is often reported in social media and regular media, that cortisol is the ultimate evil, because that is not the case. Every hormone in our body has its positive sides and its purpose. This is also true for cortisol. It is a very important hormone, and there are more problems when the level is too low than when it is too high. Problems only arise when it is consistently too high. Cortisol is our active hormone, which means in the morning, when we get up, we have the highest cortisol release of the whole day. And that's a good thing, and it must be that way because it wakes us up. Therefore, it is so important that we don't drink coffee, eat carbohydrates, or consume sugar within the first hour after waking up, ideally within the first 2 hours. Otherwise, what I described earlier happens. The cortisol receptors, which are already 4 times as many in the belly fat, get an additional blood sugar spike from the coffee. Yes, even from black coffee, because caffeine does what it's supposed to do. It wakes us up, and this always leads to a rise in blood sugar. With carbohydrates and sugar, it's even more pronounced, and this multiplies, which we certainly do not want. Cortisol is not only responsible for processing carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, but also for our immune response. I think we all know this. We experience a lot of stress. Our cortisol levels are always high, and as soon as we take a vacation and relax, cortisol levels drop and we catch a cold. This is not imagined, even though I often hear people say they think they're imagining it or something. It is real because when we're running from the saber-toothed tiger, to put it simply, and cortisol levels are high, it tells the body, we need to flee, otherwise we'll be killed by the saber-toothed tiger, so start the metabolism, release all the glucose, all the sugar you have, burn it because we need all the energy. Keep the immune system up. We don't have time to be sick. We need to survive. When cortisol levels drop, it tells the body, now I don't care, you can be sick and gain whatever. But this only works to a certain extent. If we just need to briefly run away from the saber-toothed tiger, it's something cool. This is why HIIT workouts are extremely healthy, even though they also raise our cortisol levels. However, if we are already stressed all day long at work, with children and with a partner perhaps, and then I also do a HIIT workout during the break or in the evening, raising my cortisol levels even more, I can't come down at all. Then cortisol does the opposite because I'm permanently under stress, leading to constantly high blood sugar levels. Insulin comes in and says, we need to lower the blood sugar. This can't go on. Insulin is our fat storage hormone, and it gets stored exactly where we have the most receptors in space, leading to a vicious cycle, putting us at higher risk for various diseases, including diabetes, and throwing our body off balance. To delve specifically into cortisol and fat storage in the body, cortisol causes fat to be redistributed in our body. If we constantly have elevated cortisol levels, our body will redistribute fat. For example, if I have a bit of fat on my arms or legs, the body will say, no, let's move it all to the belly because there are the most cortisol receptors and I need it there. This is the first thing that happens. It then increases fat synthesis and boosts the storage of fat cells in the abdominal area. This is known as lipogenesis, and it further increases insulin resistance. When you constantly have high cortisol levels and thus high blood sugar levels, eventually the pancreas, which secretes insulin, becomes overwhelmed and less responsive, leading to insulin resistance. When you then consume sugar, it becomes even harder for your body to metabolize it compared to when you have a normal insulin response. This also leads to lipolysis, which, as I mentioned earlier, can lead to short-term fat burning. This is effective in the short term during exercise, but if you have elevated cortisol levels for an extended period, it results in increased fat storage, especially in the abdominal area. Since I've known and intensely studied this for several years, it's noticeable in certain types of people. You probably recognize them, generally slim individuals who have a belly. They are often stressed and exhausted. Not everyone shows it outwardly, but there is this classic type of person who is permanently stressed. It's important to note that this is not something judged by science, but rather from the observer's perspective. Stress is different for everyone. It's not about what happens externally, which we can't control. There are many studies and stories, like those from Tony Robbins, where the same event is experienced differently by different people. For example, during a lunar or solar eclipse, one person might find it incredibly beautiful, while another finds it stressful and exhausting. The experience is subjective and should not be judged. In many of my podcast episodes, I discuss stress management and provide effective, simple methods to cope with it. The stress we experience is often self-generated. We can't change others or the environment, but we can change our stress response, which is crucial. What are possible causes of a permanently elevated cortisol level? As mentioned, stress is a significant factor and it's always individual. The second factor is sleep deprivation, a crucial point. I have an entire podcast episode on sleep. If you want to learn more, listen to it, as it's relatively early in the series. Sleep is essentially free stress management, free repair for our body and cells, anti-aging, and aids in weight loss. Prioritize your sleep. Next is dietary habits. I have a podcast episode on blood sugar, which is very important. Sugar, carbohydrates, juices, and porridge, foods often marketed as healthy, do not benefit our blood sugar and cortisol levels. I can only recommend it to you. If you have any questions, you can always write to me. We know that the health consequences that can result from this should not be underestimated. And that's where I come in again, saying I want everyone to feel comfortable, and I want to show you how easy it can be with small tips and tricks without having to give up on enjoying ourselves. To summarize briefly, cardiovascular diseases, increased risk of diabetes, weight gain, mood swings, and also immune system problems are just a few possibilities that can arise from visceral fat or cortisol, because they are closely related. Now, a few words on why this is connected. As I mentioned earlier, everything is interconnected because cortisol increases the deposition of fat, especially in the abdominal area. When we have more belly fat, we automatically have more cortisol receptors, which in turn lead to more inflammatory reactions in the body, which then release hormones such as leptin or insulin, which in turn affect fat distribution and hunger. And so, as you can see, everything is interconnected, as thankfully everything in our body is interconnected. So I will never be able to consider any one part separately without having to look at or consider everything else anyway. Thankfully, everything is interconnected. This can also be seen positively, because if I turn one part in a positive direction, all other things will also change positively. So I always find a really cool perspective. And finally, as always, I have a few practical tips and tricks for you. In this case, it's about nutrition to simply keep or lower the cortisol level a bit. What's great, for example, is when you're hungry, instead of a snack consisting of sweets or carbohydrates, just take nuts. Nuts like walnuts, hazelnuts, almonds, macadamia nuts are healthy. Nuts to avoid are cashews, which are seeds and not good for our intestines, and unfortunately peanuts are not so healthy either. I really advise against them. But the 4 types I mentioned before, also in the form of nut butter. Note, there are many types of nut butter where something else is included, especially sugar, so make sure you buy pure nut butter. It tastes sweet anyway. Tip number 2 on nutrition that helps keep cortisol levels low is vegetables, especially fiber-rich ones and low-carb ones. For example, I recommend broccoli, green vegetables in general. A few fruits like berries can also help you. Legumes are also a cool alternative to keep cortisol levels low because they contain protein and fiber. They also ensure that our insulin level remains constant, even though they probably cause a short-term increase when eaten, but then stabilize it. Proteins are also really cool. For example, I recommend yogurt, but please use full-fat yogurt. Yes, you heard correctly. Please also check the ingredients list for yogurt. Often, with these low-fat light products, fat is replaced by sugar, which is even worse. Also, check that there are as few ingredients as possible. Tofu, tempeh, meat, fish, eggs, whatever you want. But that definitely helps us. and also green tea. Green tea contains fantastic antioxidants and beneficial ingredients that can also help lower our cortisol levels. However, I wouldn't recommend drinking it in the evening anymore because it does contain some caffeine. Now, I have a few more tips and tricks for you. Anyone who knows me will laugh at this. Tip number 1 is, as always, drink water, enough water, because this is also extremely important for our cortisol levels. Our body naturally goes into a stress reaction when it's thirsty, when it lacks water. I'm already getting thirsty just talking about it. Next, it's important to keep an eye on portion sizes, not eating huge portions because, as you all know, the feeling of fullness takes time. If you're already extremely stressed, it's also important not to have unbelievably long periods without eating, as this puts the body under stress due to hunger. This means eating regularly so your body knows it will get meals in the morning, at noon, and in the evening, or if you're intermittent fasting, in the morning and at noon, or at noon and in the evening, which reduces stress. Avoiding sugar is crucial. Unfortunately, this includes fruit and fruit juices, even though they're often portrayed as super healthy. Please consider fruit like a piece of chocolate, great as dessert but not as a snack in between meals, as I mentioned earlier with healthy snacks like nuts. Very important, if you want to lose weight, please do it slowly and sustainably. It doesn't help anyone if we lose 10 kilos in a week. The body is mega stressed, and then the next week we gain back 20 kilos, which achieves nothing and disrupts all our hormones even more, as explained earlier. On the topic of exercise and abdominal fat, I want to add something very important because I've fallen into this trap myself. I used to think that if I was completely stressed out and exhausted after a workout, it was a good workout. As I said, I've always had and still have a very high stress level throughout the day. Many of you might experience the same, so it's even more important to adapt your exercise session accordingly. For example, doing something calm, doing strength training where you take a break of 1 or 2 minutes between exercises, not pushing your heart rate too high, going for a walk or jogging slowly, doing core training like Pilates, which might sound girly but is really cool for men too. These tips are important because if we go full throttle with HIIT and push our heart rate too high again, we'll likely release more cortisol, achieving the opposite effect. I hear this from you all the time. I'm already doing so much, stressing myself out, running so fast and doing everything so quickly, and it's getting worse. This is exactly what I mentioned earlier. It just accumulates more. Finally, I also want to say that there are supportive supplements available. You know we make them all in-house. It's particularly important to me that the ingredients undergo 17 checks. Everything is handmade from our own recipes. Please note, there's no miracle pill, and I always want you to know this because we always need to actively do something to maintain our health. We can only provide supportive measures. For example, chromium and inositol can stabilize or lower blood sugar levels. Then there's the B complex, which strengthens our nerves, and ashwagandha, known as a natural counterbalance to cortisol. It's important, especially with ashwagandha, not to take it continuously for more than 6 weeks, as we don't want cortisol levels to drop excessively, which could have negative effects. The most important advice I can give you has already been mentioned earlier. Additionally, practicing breathing exercises, meditation, and importantly, putting away your phone at least half an hour before bedtime in the morning and evening. This helps avoid the cortisol spike caused by browsing through videos on platforms like Reels and TikToks, as our brains can't distinguish between what's real and what's on screen. For example, we cry during emotional movies because our brains can't tell the difference. Of course, we consciously know this, but subconsciously our hormones react. Many of you may experience racing hearts or even tears while watching a movie, as our brains are adept at responding emotionally. This is a good thing, but we must protect ourselves from unnecessary stresses. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I love your feedback, so please feel free to reach out to me either on Instagram, Anina Mielenk, TikTok, Frau Apotheker, or even personally. I always look forward to hearing from you, whether it's just to say hello or share your thoughts. Remember to cherish yourself.